just saw a report that Warner Brothers is seriously considering rebooting the Harry Potter movies with new actors. What are your thoughts on that? I think that's a dumb idea. Well, as of right now, the Harry Potter franchise is 20 years old. So in a certain sense, 20 years, that's not a terrible amount of time to reboot something. The difference is that if you reboot Batman, you aren't telling the same story as Batman 89. If you reboot Batman, you're not retelling Batman Begins. You're telling a new Batman story. Maybe it's an origin again, but it's a new Batman story. And when it comes to Harry Potter, we were talking about adapting books. Like, it's a set of books. And the idea of rebooting Harry Potter means that you're once again telling the same exact stories. The movies we currently have aged incredibly well, and they're beloved. My children were all of them born after the last of those movies came out. They love Harry Potter 1 and 2. That's like if we let them stay downstairs, that's their go-to fall asleep movies, Harry Potter 1 or 2. The audience for Harry Potter is still just as invested in the movies that we currently have. So there's no point to remaking them other than to try and print money. And that's really cynical. There's a big difference between rebooting a character and rebooting a story, retelling a story, because that's a remake. We're going to remake the same thing we already made. And you do that when there's technology has changed, so you can now capture something you couldn't capture before, or the nature of the story is in a new cultural context, so there's new ideas to be explored. If you tell this story now versus then, there's new interesting things to do with it. But in the case of Harry Potter, none of that applies. It's a fantasy story kind of set in its own world. I mean, like, you know, Hogwarts is on Earth, but it's not a real place. It's, spoilers, Hogwarts doesn't really exist. It's this separate thing that's often its own world of adventures. So it's timeless. So then it's only, are the special effects up to par? And you can look at the first two, and there's some spotty CGI. Other than that, though, all of those movies hold up. And by the time you get to the last several, they have like impeccable CGI. There's nothing to complain about. So there's nothing new you can bring to the table. There's nothing to reinterpret. The fans of the books are fans of those movies. This is not a case of where it was a bad interpretation or the creator's unhappy. There's nothing new to do. It is way too soon, and there's no reason to do it. I think if they announce that, people get mad because you're like, why? I love those movies. Why are you taking this thing that I love and trying to replace it with a new one? There's nothing new you can bring to the table other than in parts 1 and 2 having a little bit better CGI when they're riding on broomsticks. So what do I think about the idea of them rebooting Harry Potter? If they're just looking to readapt the books, that's just a terrible idea. There's nothing new to do with it. Are there other stories to tell in the world of Harry Potter? Absolutely. And I think they messed up with Fantastic Beasts because they couldn't decide if they wanted to do a whimsical story about Newt and his Fantastic Beasts that's in the style and tone of the first 3 Harry Potter books and movies, or if they wanted to tell this epic story about Grindelwald and Dumbledore in the tone and style of, 5, 6, 7, and 8, the later films books. And they tried to do both at the same time, and so then the Fantastic Beasts movies are constantly in conflict with themselves. But it's a world that's so rich that there's more stories to tell. The idea that we go back and let's tell a Harry Potter story once again is just a terrible idea, because there's nothing new to bring to the table. Going back to the earlier question, make Harry Potter a TV show. Each book is a season. And I think maybe that is where there's potential to do something new different. The first 2 books, there's almost everything in there. There's a little bit that was left out, but you actually do get pretty much the whole books in the movies, besides a couple, in the first 2 books, those are a couple of the ones I actually have read. The introduction at the very beginning of Sorcerer's Stone, that was immediately was like, oh, this is really important information. It's such a big deal what went down in the opening chapter. And you don't get that at the opening of the movie. It's just Dumbledore walking down the street, turning lights on and off and throwing a baby on a doorstep. it doesn't capture all the murmurs of everything taking place. But as soon as you get into the later books, there are 800 pages or whatever, so they just had to cut so much stuff, and you can feel that. Like, as someone that hasn't read those later books but have watched the movies, you can tell they're montaging through so much information. That might be the way to do it, where you could do something different. I still wouldn't do it yet, but a few years from now, 25 years later, we're going to adapt it again, but as a TV show. So in the earlier books, we kind of flesh it out, kind of really spend time in that school year. But then when you get to the later ones, we get to put everything in there and tell this epic version of the Harry Potter saga over 70 hours, 10 hours per season or whatever. And you do 70 hours version of it. You go, that feels fresh, new, and different. And there's something new to be brought to the table because it's a different format. It's a similar format, but it is not the same format. I think there's something to that. I do not think there is something to, let's remake them in 2025 as movies again.